We're so glad you've joined us on the ERLC podcast to explore how the Bible addresses important cultural issues pertaining to life, religious liberty, marriage and family, and human dignity, and how we can walk in wisdom for God's glory and for the flourishing of our neighbors. If you're enjoying this podcast and find it helpful, please leave a review wherever you listen. This will help more people find and benefit from what we're learning together. We are grateful for the time you take to join us for these conversations.
Welcome to the ERLC podcast, where our goal is to help you to think biblically about today's cultural issues. I'm Jason Thacker, and I serve here as one of our senior fellows on the research team. The research team helps the ERLC fulfill its mission by providing the theological and ethical foundations for our organization's work, as well as articulating a Baptist vision for civic and cultural engagement. Today I'm joined by my colleagues, Miles Mullen and Alex Ward, and we're talking about the nature of the public square in light of the 40th anniversary of Richard John Newhouse's classic work, The Naked Public Square, Religion and Democracy in America. Welcome, guys, to the ERLC podcast. I'm really excited about this episode. This is the first among many episodes that we're going to be focusing on what we do in ERLC research, which for a lot of people, this may not be an area of the work at the ERLC that they're very familiar with. So I wanted to just, as we go around to kind of introduce ourselves, talk a little bit about what is research and what's your role here on the team.
I'm Miles Mullen, and I serve as a director of research in addition to serving as vice president and chief of staff at the ERLC. And my role as a director is to oversee the various things that research is doing. And we see research as foundational to the work that we do in policy and also contributing in its own way to the work of the ERLC by helping shape our distinctively Baptist voice in the public square.
My name is Alex Ward, and I'm our research associate and project manager, which is just kind of a longer title to really mean I manage day-to-day research operations. So I work with Miles. I also work with Jason, and his role as director of research to just kind of keep things moving and oversee some of our longer-term projects, the white papers, the church guides, essays that come out, have a hand in those.
One of the ways that we as the ERLC seek to equip and to educate the church is to really dive deep. And that's what we're going to do today. We're going to dive deep on a really important book, an anniversary of a book that I think many of us have read. I think that is very formative on how we think about the relationship of specifically religion and politics. And that's one of the reasons that I really love this book, The Naked Public Square, Religion and Democracy in America by Richard John Newhouse, which fittingly is celebrating its 40th anniversary. It was originally published in 1984. It's interesting because of the time period, and we're going to unpack a little bit about that. I want to hear from Alex, especially with his historical background, on kind of what's going on here and how we can better understand that. But the relationship of religion and politics, which don't often seem to mix, especially in kind of popular awareness or consciousness, but something nevertheless for Christians as we engage in the public square, we need to be thinking about these relationships, thinking about how our neighbors are thinking about these questions, navigating a lot of the supposed tensions. And then what does it look like to be authentically Christian? In our case, authentically Baptist in the public square and navigating a lot of these challenges. So I want to hear from you guys. What are some of your first impressions or first interaction with a book like this?
I'll start as the person younger than the book. My interaction with it came, honestly, not until I got to grad school. I probably cited it in a half dozen papers before then because it was a thing that I was supposed to cite as an undergrad, but I don't think I actually read it until I was in grad school. I mean, it was in a modern American political theology course. We had read Darren Dojek's book on From Bible Belt to Sun Belt, and then we paired it with this book. And so really, it was right at the end of the course, thinking through the topic, what did it mean for evangelicals to enter the public square in new ways? How did this fit into the 70s and 80s and the rise of the new right and public and conservatism? And so that was my first interaction with it. And being at the ERLC, working with our former colleague, Andrew Walker, who really was shaped by the book, having his interaction and how he talked about it helped me to think through it as I was taking the class. Really thinking through the idea that you don't get to cut yourself into religious Alex and normal Alex who can think without a religious lens. And so that was the first interaction I had with it. And it's a book that I've come back to several times even since then, just as a way of understanding the 1980s, but also the last 40 years.
Miles, what about you?
Yeah, so as the oldest person on the podcast, I actually started reading some things and first things in college as a conservative Christian and one who was interested in intellectual things, thinking things. I started reading first things and kind of backed into this book a little bit in the 90s, kind of like what Alex said, like how does that fit together? How do we bring our religious convictions into the public square, understanding that we're not in an explicitly Christian nation, and what does that look like? And regardless of whatever flaws or areas to push back on Newhouse's work, like it's a thoughtful engagement with those questions. How does someone who is a committed believer bring that into the public square and remain faithful to their convictions while also engaging those who believe differently?
Yeah, I think for me with this book, it was assigned as an optional text for a doctoral seminar that I was taking. And I remember looking at it and going, that's a really interesting title. And part of it is because I think sometimes when many people hear about a book called The Naked Public Square, maybe we think about it's related to sexuality or maybe something to like pornography and the debate over pornography. And we'll unpack a little bit about what this concept of the naked public square means. But I remember grabbing it, picking up, reading through it, and kind of devouring it in many ways. It's interesting kind of going back through the book, even as prepping for a podcast like this, and just seeing the highlights and the underlines I made, the questions that I had made in it. But it helped me to start thinking more holistically as a Christian, because Alex, you're exactly right. We often are taught, especially in contemporary American culture, that we have kind of our religious self, our religious ideas. We kind of have our Sunday morning church self, and then we have our regular self, our normal self that does everything else. So we'll say, well, yes, Sunday mornings are sacred. The rest of the week is kind of secular in that sense, that our faith has no real bearing on the rest of our lives. But all of us know inherently as Christians that there's not only a personal aspect to our faith that's very vitally important, especially as Baptists, but also a public expression of that faith, that you can't kind of check your faith at the door when you, quote, enter the public square, which I think is a really good question for us to kind of shift to a little bit. When we use language like the public square, that can be quite loaded, but it also can be a term that's quite ambiguous. What do we mean by the public square?
I would take a pretty expansive view of what that means. I mean, a lot of people think it just means politics when you hear public square. But I would say public square is anywhere where we are engaging with others in our neighborhoods and our communities, and basically engaging those who are our neighbors, as the Bible would describe them, to work together towards some shared goal or to strive against each other to try to determine what is the best thing to do for the good of the thing that we're working with. So when I talk to groups, I always say like FHA is part of the public square, or baseball leagues are part of the public square, in addition to your communal politics and those kind of things. It's wherever we're engaging our neighbors and working together for a common good. I think that qualifies as the public square.
I would echo everything you said. And I think Newhouse would agree. Like the concept of the public square is not just politics. It is those mediating institutions, which, we can all lament how they've been hollowed out. But I think Newhouse really highlights that for most of us, those are actually probably the more important public squares that we interact with. I know we all have this wonderful vision of like Mr. Smith goes to Washington and changes everything. Like it's very unlikely that we're going to do that. Most likely what's going to happen is I'm going to interact with the cashier at the grocery store, and I'm going to be involved in the local referendum about raising penny taxes to repair our roads and things like that. Like those are the public squares that we actually interact with most closely and probably have the most meaning to our lives. And so part of understanding the naked public square is having a vision that includes politics. Like it's not unimportant. It recognizes that politics is not the most important part of your life. National politics is not the most important part of your life. And that's something I think, if you listen to this series, I believe the first episode where Brent talked about his vision for what Christian engagement with the public square looks like, it was really grounded in, we're Baptists, we're local church people, and so our politics is also going to be local. We don't turn first to the national. We look to our neighbor right around us. And so I think thinking about the public square that way is probably, it's a good start and often probably a good corrective for people like us who want to engage in politics in a meaningful way.
Alex, I really like the way that you talk about kind of the different levels, because I think often when we say the word politics or the public square or political engagement or even social engagement or cultural engagement, we'd immediately go to like federal government or even kind of global politics or something. We go to the highest level rather than realizing there are actually multiple levels up here. And sometimes it's actually good to solve those problems at the local level rather than always having to go to the national. But it's interesting when you say politics, because I think a lot of people, as you kind of rightly pointed out, a lot of people, when they hear the word politics, immediately think of partisan politics. It's one of the reasons that when I teach some elements of this book and kind of introducing to a lot of my students to a lot of Newhouse's concepts, I always like to pair that with a very excellent work by Jonathan Leeman called How the Nations Rage, and help them to understand, I guess, kind of the public aspect of our faith, to realize that when we say politics or political engagement, most of the time in society, we often think of partisan politics, the color of hat we wear, the color of tie, it's our team, it's us versus them type of mentality. And there's an element of that. But kind of historically defined, when you think about politics or political philosophy, you're talking about politics proper, which is the way that we commonly kind of order society, the way that we think through the kind of us aspect. It's not just me. It's not just what I want. It's not just my vision, quote, of the good, but it's really our vision, a common vision, hopefully, as we seek to move together, move forward. And it's that public aspect of our common shared life together, not just me, not just my tribe, not just my people, but all of us coming together at the local level. When we talk about Newhouse and we talk about this idea of the naked public square, what does he mean by that? Obviously, he's not talking about gender and sexuality in particular. He's obviously not talking about pornography or something like that. So what is this concept of the naked public square?
I mean, historically, he's talking about the sense that there was a secularized ideology that insisted through various pressures on religious people not bringing their religious convictions into the public square and into the discussions about the good life and what it means to flourish and what we should be doing and what is morality and what is virtue and those kind of things. Kind of what Alex said earlier about, this bifurcated self. That was kind of that's what he's really addressing. He's really getting at that sense in the late 70s and 80s that people of conviction, people of faith had. That was what was required of them by the dominant forces in society to be able to engage in the public square. Alex, you got anything else to add to that?
I would just say, if you were thinking like, what's an example of what this looks like practically? I think about France and their kind of very militantly state secularism. This idea that, certain religious expressions should be banned in public, the wearing certain clothing, all these types of things. Like, it is inappropriate as a French citizen to bring that element of yourself into the public square. And so we're not talking about traditional understandings of like separation of church and state, which as Baptists we would affirm. That's not necessarily what he's getting at here. He's really getting at this concept of the secular, which, Jason, I kind of want to throw it to you and ask you about that, because I know that's a topic that you teach with your students and think through in your courses at Boyce. So like, as you're talking to them about secularism and how that relates to what he's talking about, where does this fit?
Yeah, it's a really fascinating conversation because I do teach this, some elements from Newhouse, but kind of pair that with some of the thought from Charles Taylor and his really groundbreaking work from 2007, Secular Age, which if you haven't picked it up, it's quite a tome. It's about 900 pages. When we say the word secular, that's the real key. Is I always like to ask my students to say, okay, what does it mean to be secular? What do we mean when we say we live in a secular world or a secular society, or you have a, quote, secular job? And it's really interesting, even asking a couple different variations of that question, you start to pick up on something that I think Taylor really helpfully describes and kind of lays out for us. There's these different senses of the secular. When we say secular, we don't often always mean the exact same thing, especially when we talk about kind of where we are in kind of philosophical or even political history. You kind of have a more pre-modern kind of concept of the idea of secular, which many of us would affirm and understand, this idea of a sacred kind of secular divide, what Taylor calls a secular one understanding. This idea that, yes, I have a more, quote, sacred job. I'm in the elder process at my local church. I teach in ministry. I teach philosophy, ethics, theology. A lot of those ideas, I quote, have a more sacred job, more spiritual. And then you have something I think of my mother, who works in an ophthalmology office in the Nashville area. She, quote, has a secular job. in the sense that it's a worldly job, not in a negative sense. It's just the normal kind of everyday life, what most listeners to this podcast would quote, have a quote, secular job. It just means it's not a sacred job in that sense. And one of the things that, especially with Newhouse here, is it picks up on this idea of secular too. And understanding the secular too world is this kind of break or division in our lives, this kind of compartmentalization, that idea that my faith is not, quote, welcomed in the public square or the secular space, that somehow, as Lehman likes to note in his How the Nations Rage, that there's kind of this ideological metal detector at the entrance to the public square. And it goes off when you come through with your big G God. The idea that religious or religious motivations are not really welcomed in the public square. You know what kind of gods are welcomed? It's the little G gods. Because everybody has a God. Everyone has these kind of presuppositions on the way the world works, these kind of fundamental commitments. The little G gods can walk right through that metal detector, but the big G gods are not welcomed. And that's kind of picking up on this idea of secular too. And that's the thing that I think that Newhouse and Taylor and so many others have rightfully described. There's softer versions of secularism, this idea of kind of a separation of church and state. And then there's a hard secularism that you described, Alex, in terms of the French concept of laïcité, this kind of hard, unbreachable division between our private life and our public life, especially in terms of privatized religion. That's good, that freedom of worship. You have that, but you don't have real religious freedom in the sense of living that out in every aspect of your life. And that idea, this nakedness of the public square, is that we come and we kind of drop our presuppositions. We drop these kind of big fundamental kind of orienting beliefs, philosophical, theological beliefs, and somehow can come into a godless kind of secular public square, which Newhouse rightfully describes as completely untenable. It never really was possible, much less would it actually sustain a society. So, Alex, I actually wanted to ask you, I'm not a historian. I'm a philosopher and ethicist. You have delved into a lot of the history. Miles, you have this training and expertise as well. What's going on in the 1980s when Newhouse is writing this? What are some of the tensions? What are some of the difficulties? What are some of the big questions? And I think a lot of them are kind of carried on today. But what's going on in the background here?
I think one of the kind of the key things that Newhouse picks up on is 1984. This is, after Ronald Reagan's first election, the kind of emergence of the moral majority. And I think that's what's kind of in the background here, is you have a lot of people for the first time really having to reckon with, like, what does it mean to have a religious group really engaging? As he points out in one of the later chapters, like, it's not that you hadn't had religious groups engaging before. You had to have the mainline Protestants engaging for all of American history. Like, the mainline was the dominant Protestant force. It's just everybody was part of the mainline and it could be assumed. So as the mainline began to, crumble is the right word, but their power began to weaken, at least. I think we can say that for sure. And you have this kind of emergence of the moral majority, the Christian right, whatever phrase you want to use. People began to think a little differently about what does religion look like in the public square. And it's just because it was a new version of Protestant Christianity that was kind of emerging on the scene. And so that caused people to think and worry, like, oh, is Jerry Falwell trying to, create a Christian America? At several points, he's really kind of responding to the fears of people about religious majoritarianism or this fear about creating a theonomy in America. And he's kind of saying, like, no, that's not really the thing that you should be worried about. The thing you should be really trying to figure out and think through is, well, people are going to bring their religious convictions into the public square. So what we need to do is think through, what are the processes, what are the forms of democracy that can hold these things together so that it doesn't spiral out of control, and that recognize that people have sincere, faithful convictions. And so I think you also see there kind of the emergence of new religious coalitions that had just not existed before. So the emergence of Catholics and evangelicals working together, because they, whether you're taking Francis Schaeffer's concept of like creeping secularism and their understanding of co-belligerence, or however you want to frame that, this new understanding that an evangelical and a Catholic don't have to be on opposite sides of the political spectrum. They actually can very much work together on a topic like life or religious liberty, especially, or marriage, as we've seen in recent years. So I think you see these new coalitions forming, which is also kind of creating this moment of instability and causing people to really reconsider, what does it mean for religion to be in the public square in a way that had just been assumed before.
I think that's a great assessment, Alex. I think it can't be overstated just how much what Alex termed the crumbling of the main line affects this. Like there is a sense, almost a sense of entitlement among the main lines that they control the cultural mores and social values of the United States of America. And for a long time, that was actually not that big a deal because the disagreements with those who would be termed evangelical were really theological, not in how they conducted their lives, what they thought about marriage, what they thought about how, you should raise your family or those kind of things. There's broad agreement on that. The disagreements were actually over doctrinal issues, what is salvation, who is Jesus Christ, those kind of things. But they shared those cultural values and norms, and that begins to crumble. I think the term moral majority has to do with the impetus behind wanting to hold on to that old shared vision of what it means to be a good person, what it means to engage in society, that kind of thing. So there's a real disillusionment with Jimmy Carter after the 1976 election. Lots of folks voted for Jimmy Carter and found out that, although he was evangelical, he was maybe more friendly to some of the forces that they felt like were bringing about the dissolution of that agreement about society and cultural norms.
One of the things that as you read the book, it's really interesting because I think sometimes a lot of us think, well, I have to have the latest book to understand what's going on right now. And C.S. Lewis, in his introduction to On the Incarnation by Athanasius, writes about the value of old books. And I always I'm reminded of that. This isn't a super old book. This is only 40 years. But it's interesting. One, in 1984, he sees some significant shifts taking place in culture and society. And often I think there's kind of a nostalgic longing to get back to yesteryear. Things were better. Well, the reality is they were better for some. They were not probably better for everyone, obviously. There are certain advantages, technological, social, political changes that have taken place that are good. We don't just want to get back to yesteryear, but also kind of a reminder that, God's word is sufficient and good for the place that he's put us. He's designed us. He's called us to be present. And I think the value of a book like this helps us to see sometimes even clearer what's actually going on today and some of the forces and some of the ideas that are shaping society today with a little bit of clearer vision and understanding actually what's going on rather than getting lost in a lot of the kind of presuppositions, some of the language of the day. And something that kind of stood out to me as I was kind of rereading and reworking through the volume is he's getting at this question. Obviously, the naked public square is that idea that religion or faith is not really welcomed into the public square, not just welcomed into the public square to be, quote, represented, but to have any bearing on our public life together. And it's interesting. Obviously, there's some significant shifts taking place. Newhouse is really interesting because he's kind of critiquing both sides of a debate. He's critiquing kind of the moral majority of the day, but also kind of this more progressive kind of ideology that says, faith is not welcomed. And he points out multiple times throughout the volume that there is a vacuum created when you say that religion or faith is not welcome in the public square. There's a vacuum created and something fills that vacuum. Nothing is truly neutral, whether it's a piece of technology, a social media algorithm or whatever, or a law. There is nothing that is actually neutral. Nothing can be that. And at one point in the volume, he talks about there's this vacuum that's created, and it isn't a question of are the big questions being addressed. It's a question of who's addressing them and what kind of value, what kind of vision of the good life are they seeking to instantiate. He calls it a totalitarian monism. That's a really fancy way to say that this idea of one kind of mono belief, and it's totalitarian in the sense that it seeks to rule the day.
I personally think that's one of the lasting observations of the book that's just straight spot on. And I think this goes back to not just culturally, but individually. You can go back to even to Calvin, who talks about within each person, there is the seeds of piety that will find itself worked out in worship of Jesus Christ or in some sort of idolatry. One of the warnings he gives is that if there is a forceful nakedization of the public square, I made that up, that it's not, like you said, Jason, truly naked. Something will fill that spot. And the danger is that what will fill that spot is the state. We've observed that historically, and then the state becomes the highest good towards which people work in some way. It becomes an ideology of communism or Marxism or National Socialism or something like that. So something's going to fill that spot. And I would say that this parallels the observation that people like David Foster Wallace have made, that everybody worships something, right? And even in our court cases on conscientious objection, that came out in the 60s. There's this recognition by the Supreme Court that when people that are not religious in a traditional sense act in a way in which there is a higher good or higher draw on their life to which they're committed, that they will count that as if it were religious for protections for them to not have to engage in war. Right? So everybody's recognizing this, and Newhouse is putting a sharp point on that and really kind of warning about that. And I think that warning is maybe even more acute today than it was when he first wrote the book, that something is claiming people's loyalty. There's no empty set when it comes to religion for people.
Claiming it under the guise of pretending that it's not. That's the danger here. It's not the kind of concept that like the wars of religion ended after the Reformation. But in reality, like what's happened is we still have our wars of religion. It's just different religions. It's in our politics. It's in our other assortments of how whatever we find is the most good. If you've read Tara Isabella Burton's book on new religious movements, like if you look at all the data, like something like a third of Generation Z are nuns, like they're religious nuns, they're not affiliated. They search for meaning and transcendence in a new way. And whether that's in like their spin cycle, Peloton groups, whether it's in these like fandoms, like I'm a Swiftie by proxy. And when I went to the Taylor Swift concert with my wife, there were people around me, you would have thought it was like a church experience for them. Like their hands were up, some of them were crying, watching it. Like it was a very religious experience for them. So this idea that we get to not be religious or worshiping creatures just doesn't exist. But when it's not tied to some formal religion, we get to tell ourselves, oh no, I just love it because it's good or because of something else. And then we're able to sneak in the principles behind it under the guise of neutrality. And that, I think, is one of the things that he offers as a warning, but also as like the place of faithful Christians and religious people in general. Is part of our work is to like show the disjunct to people and to reveal to them like, no, you have religious convictions. You're just not foregrounding them in the same way that I am. We're not both, in Lehman's words, we're not both coming in here fighting on behalf of our gods here. I'm just open about it, and you get to pretend that you're not.
One of the things that you're doing there, Alex, that I really love is when I teach apologetics here at the college, I always like to remind one of the burgeoning areas of apologetics is cultural apologetics, to be able to kind of understand what's going on in culture, to be able to tell a better story, as our friend Joshua Shattrell says. And it's interesting with Newhouse, on page 139 of his work, he says this, he says, contrary to the dogmas of secular enlightenment, this kind of idea of kind of a neutral kind of public space, he said, religion has neither withered away, nor can it successfully be confined to the private spheres of life. It didn't go away, as a lot of people predicted, that religion will just kind of fade into the background, but nor can it be really privatized. Everybody's worshiping something. I always like to remind my students when we talk about worldview, everyone has a worldview, whether they realize it or not, whether it's consistent or not. Everyone has a vision of the world. They have a theological understanding. Something Newhouse points out very quickly in the volume is that really every big debate that we have in society at its core is a theological debate. It's a kind of that bigger vision, that understanding that everyone has a theology. Everyone has an anthropology. What does it mean to be human? What is the nature of reality? What is truth? What is knowledge? Everyone has an ethic. And we're seeing that kind of clashing happening in the public square, which I think Newhouse and Taylor help us to realize, secular one is no longer really kind of in use in that sense. It's not a common way we describe it. Secular two, that idea of kind of a neutral public space never really was possible. That maybe we live in what Taylor calls a secular three, this age of contested belief, that we have this kind of warring of worldviews, a warring of loves and passions, a warring of this vision of the good life. And that actually is not only true in the 1980s, but especially true in 2024, where we're starting to see a lot of these clashing visions. Newhouse kind of reframes that. Instead of just going to war, maybe we actually try to sit down at the table to understand where each other are coming from, not in the sense of toleration that we just accept everything. This is a principled pluralism. It's not just a pluralism that everyone has their own truth and that kind of failed postmodern understanding. Everybody has their own vision of truth and reality, and that there's no real conflict. No, there are real conflicts. There are real tension points, especially when we seek to do life together as a society. Coming together to navigate these public social realities is to say, okay, what do we do then? what's our path forward in that sense? And I think Newhouse put forth a pretty compelling vision of not just a pluralism that accepts all things, but more of a principled pluralism, a toleration. Getting back to what toleration really means. Toleration isn't that I just accept and promote and celebrate in kind of this expressive individualistic type of mentality, but it's actually tolerating the sense of, I think you're wrong, you think I'm wrong, but I'm going to tolerate you, and you're going to hopefully tolerate me as we seek to do something together. And so he gets through kind of an ethic of compromise, not in a negative sense, but what can we do? What kind of ground can we gain together as we seek to kind of organize life around some vision, maybe hopefully a more common or shared vision of the good, but that seems to be more disparate by the day. And that idea of a principled pluralism rather than just kind of that totalitarian type of mindset. And I think there's a lot of things that are helpful for us as we think as Christians, especially as Baptists. I mean, obviously he's a Lutheran when he writes this, becomes Roman Catholic after that. But I think he kind of puts forth a helpful vision for a Baptist engagement in the public square, which is a lot of what we're doing at ERLC, but specifically within the research area. And a lot of what we're doing with our research fellows in the Research Institute is to think through what's a distinctly Baptist vision for the public square. So I think that may be a good place for us to kind of start to wrap up our conversation a little bit, to hear from you all, to say, what are some of the defining aspects of a Baptist vision for the public square? If the naked public square is untenable, never was really possible, then what does it mean as Baptists to engage in the public square, being authentically Baptist, but more importantly, authentically Christian in our approach to public life and our shared life together?
I think for me, like a Baptist vision of the public square begins with the local community. You know, the Baptists ecclesiologically are very much about the local church and being a group of believers that are covenanted together to serve the Lord in a local congregation. And I think that naturally focuses us rightly on our local context and what can we do to do good for our neighbors in that local context. What can we do to work together to improve what's going on locally, and always and forever, like taking the opportunity to share the gospel with those folks, because, you know, we need to be working towards the common good, but we need to be making sure we're taking opportunity to share with them about the ultimate good at the same time. So I think a Baptist perspective starts with the local and then works its way out from there.
I think a Baptist vision of the public square and engagement is necessarily positive. So I really love John Leland, and he has this great quote where he talks about kind of arguing against state-sponsored religion and the critics who said, well, if we don't pay for churches and pastor salaries out of our taxes, then religion's going to wither away. And he has this great response to the Anglicans in Virginia, and he says, like, look, the truth doesn't need government support. It's error that needs government support. At the end of the day, it's because it's so weak that you fly to the government to support it. If it were actually true, it can stand naked in the public square. And I think that a Baptist vision of the public square starts there. Like, we actually believe as Baptists, we don't just believe in religious liberty for no reason. We believe in it because we believe each soul is competent to respond to God's drawing and calling. And so part of what a Baptist engagement looks like is like, we believe in persuasion. We believe that people and the truth can be persuasive, that good can convince people. And so I think that affects how we engage politically. Like, when I engage with someone across the aisle, I don't immediately start with them as an enemy combatant who has to be overcome. I start with them as someone, as I often tell our interns, there's someone who's been deceived by a lie, by Satan, by the powers of the air. And so, like, my goal is to persuade them of the truth and of the good and of the beauty of what God has called us to. And so I think that's Christian in its understanding of creation and goodness, but I think it's distinctly Baptist because it is not relying on state-sponsored support. It's relying on individuals interacting with other individuals, sharing the good news. Like, we are evangelicals. We are people of the good news. So in many ways, it makes it easier than trusting in a voting block to affect ultimate public good.
That fits exactly with kind of our vision of what we want to accomplish at the ERLC, of bringing hope to the public square. There's a inherent hopefulness in that, like a convictional optimism about that we are hopeful for what God can do to transform people's lives in bringing them to salvation through Jesus Christ, but we're also hopeful for what God can do in our communities, in our states, in our nation, because we have hope in Him. As Alex said, it's not about those other things. It's about, like, our confidence in Him.
As a former coworker of ours, Andrew Walker used to tell me when he was on staff, and I know he tells his students at Southern Seminary, the best thing in the world for Bernie Sanders is not for Bernie Sanders to stop being a Democrat and to change all his policy positions. The best thing for Bernie Sanders is for him to become a Christian. And that's at the heart of what it means to be Baptists who are engaging in these issues, is we see the first and primary thing that needs to change is heart change, because we believe that politics is a part of culture and culture is downstream from individuals and conscience. And so we believe that the heart has to change first before any of these other things can change.
Yeah, you guys are exactly right. And it just reminds me of, as Baptists, as we engage in the public square, we're first and foremost evangelistic. We're sharing the good news that is central to what it means to be Baptist, that we can do more together than we can separately, whether that's mission, sending missionaries to the ends of the earth, or next door to plant churches. With education, we can do more together than we can separate. And it's always first and foremost the name of Jesus is at the tip of our tongues. That is why it animates everything we do, and it drives everything we do. It reminds me of the Baptist Faith and Message, one of the articles on religious liberty that says that a free church and a free state is the Christian ideal. That idea that the unencumbered nature of the church being able to do her job, to be able to share the good news of the gospel to the ends of the earth, but then also seeking to say, okay, what does that mean for our common life together? And creating a space that we can actually disagree with one another. Look, we can disagree about ultimately important things, but we don't have to hate each other. Ephesians 6:12 reminds us that we don't wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the principalities and powers of evil. And then we're called to live in this in between the times in light of that reality, in light of what Christ has done. And that revolutionizes every single aspect of our life. It's not a privatized reality. It's not a Sunday morning reality, but it's something that permeates every single aspect of our life, both personally as well as socially. And I think that's something that Newhouse encourages me, at least, to start thinking more holistically about my faith and how we engage in the public square with that posture of hope. So I really appreciate this conversation. It's been fun to hang out with you guys a little bit, talking about a really important book, Richard John Newhouse's The Naked Public Square, Religion and Democracy in America, that's celebrating its 40th anniversary here in 2024. So continue on with the ERLC podcast series. There's lots of really helpful podcasts and interviews coming out. And as always, the ERLC seeks to be a resource for the local church, helping to promote and bring hope into the public square. So thank you guys for joining us today. An essential component of the Christian life is how we live out our faith in public. Despite what many envision today as a naked public square devoid of any religious influence, Christians know that we cannot simply check our faith at the door, nor should we. Everyone brings their vision of the good life, including their own gods, into the public square. An authentic faith is holistic and affects everything about our lives if we're truly new creations in Christ. Christians need to engage holistically in the public square, both for the glory of God as well as the love of neighbor at every level of society, seeking to bring true hope to our common life together. Join us again next time for part 1 of a special 2-part series entitled Hope in the Public Square. We'll be joined by ERLC President Brent Leatherwood and Daniel Darling, the Director of the Land Center for Cultural Engagement at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. They'll be discussing godly political engagement in a messy political landscape, giving an overview of these issues we're watching in the election season, as well as talking about how to anchor our trust in Christ as we seek the good of our communities.